First of all, I want to wish everyone a happy new year. I hope everyone had a good holiday season at the end of 2024, the beginning of 2025. With that said, I want to continue with my work as usual. I have written an article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled Washington's Unstoppable Superweapon. And this was published at the very end of December. And I believe that this is very important for people to understand as we talk about Russia's new intermediate range ballistic missile, the Redirection, and we talk about Russia's military industrial output. And I'm going to cover in the weeks ahead breakthroughs by China in the field of military technology, shipbuilding, drones, aircraft. As we talk about all of this, it's important to understand that even though the collective West has fallen behind militarily, they still have a very powerful super weapon that still is running rampant over entire nations around the globe. And so this is what I want to talk about. I want to continue attracting attention toward this topic. So let us begin. In recent months, even across the collective West's media, growing admissions are being made about both Russia and China's superior military industrial capacity. With Russia's first use of the intermediate range ballistic missile, the Redirection, it is admitted that Russia and likely China possess formidable military capabilities the collective West currently lacks. And I've talked about this for many months, if not years, especially in the context of the ongoing U.S. proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. Despite the collective efforts of NATO in arming, training, and backing Ukraine, Ukrainian forces continue to give ground at an accelerated rate across the entire line of contact amid the ongoing Russian Special Military Operation, SMO. Yet, even as this paradigm shift sinks in, the U.S. has demonstrated it still possesses a powerful and so far unparalleled and yet unanswered superweapon. It uses it to create conditions across the Arab world to slowly and steadily hollow out both the Syrian economy and the Syrian Arab army, resulting in the total collapse of both in mid-December 2024, just last month, after years of staving off US-backed terrorists attempting to overrun the country. And that was having begun as early as 2011. Libya collapsed in 2011. Syria hung in there. Russia intervened in 2015. The US was occupying eastern Syria, Turkey occupying northern Syria, and they managed to hold off this US-sponsored regime change operation until last month. The US ultimately prevailed, and there's no getting around that. Not only did the Syrian economy, army, and thus government collapse, many across the world cheered on as UN-listed terrorist organizations seized power in Damascus and publicly carried out atrocities in Syria's streets against ethnic, religious, and political opponents. This was happening openly, but because of the control the collective West still maintains over global media, global information space, they were able to convince many in the general public around the world that this was a positive development, even though it was literally Al-Qaeda seizing control of an entire nation, backed by the US and its regional allies. All of this is owed to Washington's unanswered superweapon and its control over global information and political space. So I think you could see where I'm going. This is not a weapon in a military sense. It is a weapon in political and media sense, but a weapon nonetheless. Not as glamorous as an Redirection missile, Washington's superweapon is in fact many times more powerful and more difficult to defend against. Beginning as regime change operations carried out by the US Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, it has transformed over the years, that I would say decades, into what is now known as the National Endowment for Democracy, and it also includes subsidiaries and adjacent organizations. Now, I want to point this article out, and the links to all of these articles, which I included in my article, these will all be available in the video description below. This is a New York Times article from 1986, Missionaries for Democracy, U.S. Aid for Global Pluralism, and they're talking about the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy, and they admit that it is a continuation of CIA regime change operations around the globe. They admit it. It's admitted. So people who try to deny there's some sort of link between the NED and the CIA, that they're ignoring the admissions of the US and its own media they themselves have made over many years. The NED oversees a network of subsidiaries: Freedom House, the International Republican Institute, IRI, the National Democratic Institute, NDI, as well as adjacent government organizations like USAID and private foundations such as Open Society and the Omidyar Network, which fund hundreds of organizations, projects, opposition groups, and political parties on every inhabited continent on Earth. When people try to mock those exposing U.S. interference around the globe, and they say everything is because of the U.S. and its interference, right? They sarcastically make these type of statements. But if you go to the NED's official website right here, and they are literally working on every single continent, except of course, North America, which is where the US government is located and presides over. Absolutely every other continent on Earth, the NED is operating in, and in every country on every continent. And they used to have entire pages for each country listing all of the programs they were funding, interfering admittedly in elections, in their legal system, their constitution, their education system, media, absolutely every component of a nation's national sovereignty, the NED was involved in interfering in, admittedly. So let us continue. Let's talk about the different regions of the world, more specifically, starting with the Middle East and setting the battlefield for war with Iran. In recent years, it trained armies of agitators, the NED and the State Department, US State Department, years ahead of the 2011 Arab Spring to return to their home nations and overthrow their respective governments. Now, it is very important to understand, many people think that the Arab Spring was a spontaneous uprising across the entire Arab world, which already begs belief. And they say that the US opportunistically hijacked it. This is not true. The US engineered it years in advance, and when it was ready and the conditions were right, it triggered a massive regional uprising led by US-backed, trained, funded agitators, networks that they have been building up for years. And we now know this because it is admitted. And also there is a lot of documented evidence attached to the groups that were leading the protests. This is a 2011 New York Times article. US group helped nurture Arab uprisings. And down here it says a number of the groups and individuals directly involved in the revolts and reforms sweeping the region received training and financing from groups like the International Republic Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and Freedom House. Down here, it explains that they're all subsidiaries of the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, and that ultimately they are overseen, directed, and funded by the US State Department, the US government. And down here, it admits that many of these agitators were being trained as early as 2008 at these technology meetings. They also admit were funded by the US State Department. So the Arab Spring was engineered by the US years in advance. Very important to understand that. The political turmoil these US-backed agitators created was leveraged by likewise US-backed armed extremists to violently depose governments that refused to cave to political pressure. So at the same time, years in advance of the Arab Spring in 2011, the US was also preparing armed extremists. And we know this because likewise, the Western media admitted this. This was a New Yorker article from all the way back in 2007 by Seymour Hersh, titled The Redirection. The link will be in the video description below. And it talks all about how to undermine Iran and also its ally Syria. The US is bolstering Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam, I would say politically perverted version of Islam, and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. They're basically Al-Qaeda, and it includes the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is the foundation from which many of these extremist groups spawned, including Al-Qaeda and also ISIS, the self-proclaimed Islamic State. While the NED's own website claims it promotes freedom around the world, its political interference has destabilized and destroyed entire nations and even whole regions of the planet. Again, the Arab Spring is an example of this, a recent example of this, leading to hundreds of thousands of dead and millions displaced. What is left of these nations is rendered into an internally warring failed state or a client regime serving Washington's interests entirely at the expense of the targeted nation's own best interests, and sometimes a combination of both. The region itself is taking a very deliberate shape aimed at encircling, isolating, and eventually targeting and toppling the nation of Iran, which represents the center of resistance to US hegemony in the region. It's not that Iran poses some sort of actual threat to the United States. It is a obstacle to US primacy over the entire region, so they want to remove it so they can control and squat on the entire region. Let's talk about the National Endowment for Democracy in Europe and the creation of a democratic Russia. Another example is Ukraine. Efforts by the US NED to overthrow an independent and neutral Ukraine began as early as 2004, not 2014, as early as 2004. And this was admitted by The Guardian. Again, the Western media admits all of this. This is their article from 2004, US campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev. So there was an initial attempt in 2004 to overthrow the Ukrainian government and install a client regime. It failed. The US repeated this process again in 2014. And it succeeded. And it admits the campaign is an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that in 4 countries in 4 years has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. But again, elections, so-called democracy, is supposed to be a process of self-determination. Everything about these movements that the US involved itself in is being determined by Washington. So this is not democracy. This isn't the US promoting democracy. This is the US undermining it and politically interfering in the name of democracy. It's very important to understand it. It also admits in this article that it wasn't just Ukraine. They admit that this was done in Serbia in 2000. It was done again in 2003 in Tbilisi, Georgia, and they targeted Belarus as well, and that one failed. And we remember the US overthrew the government of Georgia in 2003. From 2003 to 2008, just as they did in Ukraine from 2014 onward, they began militarizing, NATOizing Georgia, and then in 2008, the Georgian military attacked Russian peacekeepers, triggering the 2008 Georgian-Russian war. And the EU itself conducted an investigation and found it was Georgia that provoked that conflict. An identical operation, so we're talking about in 2004, The Guardian admitting all of this, an identical operation would repeat itself again in 2014, this time succeeding. It included not only NED-funded political agitators, but also armed extremists, including neo-Nazis, joined on stage by US senators, cheering them on in Kiev. So it wasn't just the US voicing support from the United States. There were US senators who literally traveled to Kiev and took the stage in the middle of the protests, essentially leading them and cheering them on. We have articles like this that reported on this phenomenon. US cozies up to Kiev government, including far right. And if you could, it was John McCain. He was one of the US senators on stage. You have a picture of him, and he is with a neo-Nazi political party. And they even describe it in this NBC News article as neo-Nazi right here. Ultra-right and anti-Semitic in the Western media's own words. And when this became politically inconvenient, they began papering over this fact that they installed into power neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Just as they're papering over the true nature of the opposition they've installed into power in Syria, the fact that they are Al-Qaeda, and they're chopping people's heads off because they're the wrong religion, the wrong ethnicity, or have the wrong political thoughts. The purpose of NED-funded political interference undermining the political independence of targeted nations is not only to politically capture the nation itself, but cobble it together with other captured states within the region to form a unified front against Washington's chief adversaries. In Europe, this adversary is clearly Russia. Damon Wilson, Damon Wilson, who is now the president and CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy. This is his bio right here on the NED's official website. This is what he said about all of this when he was part of the Atlantic Council.
The premise of my argument is that we owe it to those struggling for their own nationhood, their own freedom to choose their destiny, to recognize that this region is no gray zone. This is the front line of freedom. They merit our support. Permitting these nations' aspirations to be held hostage by Russian occupation and intimidation is a recipe for instability and conflict in Europe. We cannot allow these nations, known as captive nations for much of the 20th century, to become known as hostage nations of the 21st century. The aim is to anchor a vulnerable, insecure zone in the certainty of a stable and prosperous and free Europe. And over the long term, this vision includes a democratic Russia. But the pathway to reform in Moscow might just begin with choices that are made in Kiev, Chisinau, Yerevan, and Tbilisi.
He would talk about eliminating what he called gray zones of insecurity between NATO and Russia. These gray zones were simply neutral nations that provided a buffer between NATO and Russia, which included Ukraine. The US, NATO, Damon Wilson at the Atlantic Council, and many others like him did not want neutral nations between NATO and Russia. They wanted NATO right up on Russia's border because eventually they wanted to undermine and overthrow Russia and then absorb Russia itself. So if you missed that, I'm going to repeat it again also for the sake of reading my article out in its entirety. I quoted that in the article. The strategy is not meant to create a new dividing line in Europe. The aim is to anchor a vulnerable, insecure zone, a neutral buffer zone essentially, in the certainty of a stable and prosperous and free Europe, which we know are all just a smokescreen for a US-dominated Europe that serves US interests at its own expense. And over the long term, this vision includes a democratic Russia. When they say democratic Russia, they mean a Russia dominated, subordinated to the United States. But the pathway to reform in Moscow might just begin with choices that are made in Kiev, Chisinau, Yerevan, and Tbilisi. So he's talking about we need to carry out regime change in all of these nations that are neutral buffer zones between NATO and Russia. We topple them, we isolate and encircle Russia, then we can topple and absorb Russia itself. This is what he's actually saying, and this is what Russia has been reacting to for years and years. This is an admission of intent. The overthrow and political capture of Ukraine, Moldova, Armenia, and Georgia are meant to further encircle and isolate Russia, removing any buffer zone between NATO and Russia before eventually overthrowing and politically capturing Russia itself. A democratic Russia is a euphemism for a Russia subjugated under US NATO-imposed democracy controlled and administered by the NED-funded organizations, media platforms, institutions, and political parties. So I think you can see how this super weapon is wielded. The remarks Wilson made in 2018 have translated not only into US NATO policy vis-a-vis Russia, but also into action within the NED Wilson now serves as president and CEO of. So he was talking about doing this at the Atlantic Council. Now he is involved in actually doing it at the NED. Let's talk about the NED in Asia. And what do you think the NED is doing in Asia? It is creating a unified front against China, America's chief adversary in the region and its chief adversary worldwide, I would say. The NED's Asia webpage, now stripped clean of the financial disclosures that propped up an illusion of transparency, boasts of over 338 projects operating in 16 countries, receiving at least 51.7 million US dollars in 2023 alone. Let's look at that page right here. NED Asia. Now, they used to have here, explore where we work. You see, they have it all divided into regions. So if you click on Asia, it just goes to the Asia page. It used to go to a list of nations in Asia, and it used to disclose specific programs. And this was all about transparency, because democracy, according to the United States, cannot exist without transparency. Well, now all of these programs are covert. And if you go to the Asia page, you can see everything that you see on here. So if you see protests in the news where you see protests in Asia and they're all flashing three fingers, It's on the NED website. That means the NED is behind it. It's funding it. It's funding all the core groups leading these protests, supporting these protests. It's very simple. Even though they're obfuscating all of the funding, you can still very clearly sort out what the NED is doing and how it is doing it. They have leaders, scholars, and practitioners from across the Indo-Pacific region meet in Japan, and that this is what they do. They network all of these people together. They compromise them, they indoctrinate them, they use scholarships, fellowships to reel them in, they stitch them together, and they create a unified front against China. And they just spend millions of dollars every single year building it up. Here, they admit that they're interfering in China's internal political affairs. What's worse, and I'm going to talk about this in the article, they talk about the political environment in mainland China, East Turkestan, Tibet, and Hong Kong. There is no such thing as East Turkestan. They're referring to what is internationally recognized by the United Nations as Xinjiang, a western region of China. It's Chinese territory. NED, by referring to it as East Turkestan, which is what separatists the US is supporting call it, and only separatists call it, is openly admitting that they are interfering and undermining China's territorial integrity in violation of the United Nations Charter, in violation of international law. And that's just one example of many on this page here. And if you scroll down, you see how they use these awards to aggranize their puppets. That's essentially what these people are. They are puppets that the US is using. They put up these public displays to reinforce the fabricated narratives the US government and their proxies are creating and perpetuating. You can see they're involved absolutely everywhere. They have infiltrated and co-opted labor unions. Obviously, the US, run by Wall Street, has no interest in genuine labor unions. They want to undermine them. They want to replace them with labor unions that interface with Wall Street, not hold Wall Street accountable. And here we are. Here's a spotlight. Vote 62. This is a US government-funded program interfering in Thailand's elections. That's what that is. And you can see by the very style of the banner that this was all connected to ILAW. And if you go to the web page, you can see again the green and white and black. This is telltale sign of ILAW. And right down here, if you look, there is ILAW. And I've gone over ILAW many times. If you go to their website, they at least admit that they are funded by the US government through the NED. And they were leading a petition at one point to try to rewrite the entire constitution of Thailand. A US-funded organization that would not exist without US government money was trying to have the entire constitution of Thailand rewritten, and rewritten to reflect what? Thailand's best interest or Washington's best interest? Of course, Washington's best interest. This is how insidious and dangerous this superweapon actually is. So let me get back to the article, because I've covered almost all of this in the actual article itself. It openly admits to involving itself in the region's elections, the building of opposition parties, and even promoting separatism. I pointed that out in terms of East Turkestan, and I explain it here. The page refers to what is recognized under international law as Xinjiang, China, as East Turkestan, a non-existent entity claimed by the East Turkestan government in exile, which was created and exists in Washington, D.C. This is their official website, East Turkestan government in exile. And if you just come down here, it's literally based in Washington, D.C. It doesn't get more obvious than this. And they're calling it East Turkestan, even though it's internationally recognized as Chinese territory, and it's called Xinjiang. The U.S. government's support for separatism in China is a blatant violation of the UN Charter, which under Article 2 states, and this is a quote from the UN Charter, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. So if the U.S. doesn't use force or the threat of force directly, but is backing armed, vicious terrorists to carve out a part of internationally recognized Chinese territory, that is a violation of the UN Charter under Article 2. Not only does the US government harbor separatists in Washington, D.C., through the NED it funds a number of organizations who openly seek separatism. This includes the World Uyghur Congress, a US NED grantee which openly states on its website that, let's go over the evidence for this. Again, the NED's official website, even though they have erased the individual programs they're funding, they still have posts like this where they list all the NED grantees focused on Xinjiang, China. And you can see they even color in Xinjiang with the separatist flag that is recognized by no nation on earth, even officially not recognized by the US itself. They list all the organizations here: World Uyghur Congress, Uyghur Human Rights Project, Campaign for Uyghurs, the Uyghur Transitional Justice Database Project. They're all NED grantees, admittedly. So the World Uyghur Congress, on their official website right here, if you scroll down, they talk about opposition. It's an opposition movement against Chinese occupation of East Turkestan. So they are separatists, and they are being funded by the US government to pursue separatism. They claim they're doing it nonviolently and peacefully, but they are simply the political cover under which the armed fanatics the US is also backing are carrying out violence to pursue separatism in China. The World Uyghur Congress, funded by the US government through the NED, is openly conspiring to violate international law by seeking to separate Xinjiang from China. While the World Uyghur Congress claims it seeks to do this as a peaceful opposition movement, it is separatism nonetheless, dovetailing into violent terrorism carried out by militant Uyghur separatists like the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM. And guess where they're based right now? They're based in Syria. They fought side by side with Al-Qaeda, backed ultimately by the US through Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Israel. Having spent years fighting alongside UN-listed terrorist organization Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, also known as Jabhat al-Nusra, and also known as simply Al-Qaeda, and now openly vowing to target China, The Telegraph recently reported. Here's their article right here. Uyghur fighters in Syria vow to come for China next. The Turkestan Islamic Party says its main mission is to liberate the Muslims of East Turkestan from the Chinese occupation. Well, no one recognizes Xinjiang as occupied by China. They recognize it as part of China. And so this is a completely illegitimate cause backed by the US solely to serve US interests, not to serve the interests of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, not to serve the interests of the Chinese people, solely to carve up, divide, destroy, topple, and eliminate China as a global power so that the US alone maintains primacy over the entire planet. The NED's current Asia webpage makes it abundantly clear that its efforts aren't focused solely on the political capture of individual nations across Asia, but that it seeks to create a regional united front against China. So let's go back to the NED webpage for Asia. China's rise as a regional and global power and its economic leverage have made it a powerful benefactor to an influencer of regimes in the region. And when they talk about regimes, they talk about governments that do not answer to the United States, period. Not that they are actually autocratic or dictatorships. They simply don't do what the US tells them to do. Therefore, they're labeled regimes and smeared and lied about and have claims fabricated about them. Just as the US does all around the globe. Using its considerable financial power, China has signaled that respect for democracy and human rights is not a prerequisite or even a desirable feature for any potential partner. And by that they mean, when the NED talks about democracy and human rights, they're talking about their agitators who use both of these terms as a smokescreen to carry out US-funded sedition. That is all they mean by that. The US by far is the worst human rights violator on planet Earth this 21st century. Even the wildest accusations the US has made about China, if you were to believe they were true, pale in comparison to what the United States has done in front of the entire world. They claim that China detained 1 million Uyghurs. There's no evidence at all of this claim. The US invaded and murdered 1 million Iraqis in front of the entire world based on a deliberately fabricated claim of weapons of mass destruction. Just keep this in mind. You have to understand the context in which the US and organizations like the US government funded and directed NED tell these lies. Let's get back to this. Recognizing the need to protect and uphold democratic values, the rule of law, and rules-based institutions, and to effectively push back against the growing illiberal trends in the region, Asian democracies are exploring how to cooperate and assume a greater responsibility in the defense and maintenance of internationally recognized norms and values. When they say internationally recognized norms and values, they're talking about the US-led and imposed unipolar world order. That is what they're talking about. They're not talking about international law. They're talking about norms and values which are dictated and imposed on the world by the US. Then it continues. It says, to that end, the NED supports a variety of initiatives focused on bolstering democratic unity and cooperation among democratic nations in Asia, as well as strengthening and expanding regional solidarity and cooperation among democratic actors. Specifically, the NED and the core institutes support partners in the region's leading democracies to facilitate dialogue, build support, and promote greater leadership in defense of democracy, democratic norms, and values. It supports regional networks of democracy and human rights activists and advocates that work to amplify democratic voices, facilitate exchanges, and strengthen regional solidarity around key democratic issues such as media freedom, free and fair elections, digital security, and protection and fundamental human rights. And what they mean by this, media freedom means the freedom of the United States to seize control and dominate the information space of Asia and the individual nations there. Free and fair elections, they mean elections the US is able to interfere and direct through NED funding millions and millions of dollars interfering in regional elections. Digital security and protection, again, the US's ability to control the infrastructure that information flows through across Asia. And when they say fundamental human rights, that just means the right of their agitators to operate with absolute freedom and total impunity as they commit treason in each of these respective countries. They do not want the targeted nations to do anything to these US-funded traitors. Essentially, that's what they are. They are taking money from the US to betray their own nation's best interest in service of Washington and Wall Street's best interests. Very important to understand. That is what they really mean when they are saying this. They're obviously not supporting democracy. Look at what they have done in all of the nations they have actually toppled. Look at the actual reality of the groups they placed into power. Literal Nazis in Ukraine, Al-Qaeda in Syria. Who do you think they're trying to put into power in these targeted nations in Asia? They are putting into power, and I've covered this for many years, groups that are extremely violent, demonstrably autocratic, and who are actually, in fact, guilty of the worst human rights violations in each of these respective nations. All of this is a long-winded way of admitting the US NED seeks to create a regional anti-China movement eagerly parroting US State Department disinformation, targeting China, poisoning the region's population against China, all while expanding Washington's influence and control over all regions in Asia along China's periphery, just as it has done in Europe vis-a-vis Russia. An example of how the US NED does this was the October 2020 Beyond Boundaries Facebook Live event targeting audiences in Thailand titled Situation of the Uyghurs in China and How We Can Help Them, featuring former NED employee Louisa Grieve, now Director and External Affairs for the Uyghur Human Rights Project and NED grantee. You remember they are on the list that I showed you here. Here's the Uyghur Human Rights Project. They are funded by the US government through the NED. They're the ones who organized this Facebook Live event targeting Thai audiences. And here is the digital flyer for this event. You could see this was October 2020, Beyond Boundaries, Situation of the Uyghurs in China and How We Can Help Them. This was the speaker, Director of External Affairs for the Uyghur Human Rights Project. And who are these two moderators? These are two figures in the US-backed opposition movement in Thailand. They are the ones who were supporting the street protests that the US had organized through funding NED core organizations that provided leadership, legal aid for leaders of the protests, promoted it in the media. In the information space, the US dominates. That's who was moderating it. So you can see how the US builds up these networks and then uses these networks to poison the people of Thailand against China. So they're lying to Thai people about China carrying out some sort of genocide against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. This is not happening. This never happened. There is no evidence this has ever happened. I have spent years exposing these lies, going through these reports published by US-funded organizations and authors. There is no evidence this is happening. This is to China what weapons of mass destruction were to Iraq. It is a blatant lie the US is using to justify sanctions and also to help poison the global population against the targeted country, in this case, China. The moderators included Netawit Chotipat Paisan, a supposed pro-democracy activist who participated in and promoted NED-funded sedition aimed at Thailand itself. The purpose of the Facebook Live event was to continue poisoning receptive ties against China, despite China being Thailand's largest trade partner, investor, source of tourism. More tourists come from China to Thailand than from all Western nations combined. And infrastructure partner, including the building of Thailand's first high-speed rail line. So these are projects that China is helping Thailand build that the US would never have even thought of helping Thailand build ever. Throughout the many decades the US dominated the region, they have never built any project like this anywhere in the region. China is building high-speed rail networks across the entire region. They already have a functioning line in Laos, Thailand's neighbor to the north, and its neighbor to the north, which will eventually connect the Thai high-speed rail line when it's completed directly to China. And it has already transformed the country and helped supercharge the economy. It was one of the poorest nations in the region. And how about we talk about the high-speed rail network and how the US uses these networks to prevent real progress from taking shape. NED-funded opposition groups have also focused on outright blocking Thai-Chinese cooperation, including the ongoing Thai-Chinese high-speed rail project. The most overt example of this was when billionaire opposition leader Thanathorn Juangroongruangkit traveled to the United States to meet with representatives of the US State Department and NED subsidiary Freedom House, as well as Arizona-based Hyperloop One, before returning to Thailand to condemn the Chinese-built high-speed rail project. Now, how do we know? How do we know that Thanathorn actually visited the United States? Well, because he hired a US-based lobbyist to help arrange the trip, and they, under US law, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, had to register the paperwork for this lobbying. And if you search the document, you will see down here at the bottom all of the planned visits Thanathorn prepared ahead of his trip to the United States, which included Freedom House, the US State Department, members of Congress, all of the people that are behind the National Endowment for Democracy and funding opposition groups around the world, including here in Thailand. And as a matter of fact, upon returning home to Thailand from this trip to the US, there were general elections in 2019, which his political party he led lost in. And then he immediately mobilized street protests, and then he hid behind them as these NED-funded organizations making up the core leadership spiraled out of control into violence, blocking roads, fighting with police, beating up anyone who disagreed with them, very similar to the US-sponsored violent mobs that had overrun Hong Kong in recent years, which have now been brought under control. And upon returning home from the United States, Thanathorn Juangroongruangkit, this billionaire backed by the US to try to politically capture Thailand and erase its indigenous institutions, including the military and the constitutional monarchy, He got home, and this is what he said. He said, Thailand needs Hyperloop, not China-built high-speed rail. And he's talking about how the Hyperloop was a better deal for Thailand. It was a greater vision for Thailand's future. Well, in reality, it was non-existent, and ultimately it was shut down. It never materialized. So if the Thai people were foolish enough to listen to and believe Thanaton, they would have no infrastructure at all. And that is the point of US interference. It is not to offer a better alternative. It is to leave nations destitute, underdeveloped, and perpetually at the mercy of US domination. Thanaton insisted Thailand should instead invest in now defunct Hyperloop technology. I showed you the article, that was 2023. It finally went completely defunct. During one public presentation, Thanaton would insist that, and this is a quote, actually, let's listen to him say it, and then I will repeat it as I read through the rest of this article.
Well, we want to rebalance the game of power between big nations. I think over the past 5 years, we have been giving too much importance in dealing with China. We want to reduce that, and we want to rebalance our relationship to the Europe, to the Japan, to the US more.
So he says, I think over the past 5 years, we have been giving too much importance to China. We want to reduce that and rebalance our relationship with Europe, with Japan, and with the United States more. Thailand is located right next to China, and China is the largest, most powerful nation in the region. Why should they have a larger, more significant relationship with Europe, the US on the other side of the planet, and Japan right at the edge of Eastern Asia? What sense does that make? Especially when you look at the nature of Thailand's relationship with China and the fact that Europe, the US, and Japan combined cannot offer the same sort of economic cooperation with Thailand that China can, and they never will be able to. So it is blatant US interference, creating political leaders like Thanaton Juangroongruangkit, his political party, the many adjacent organizations that support it, that have sprouted out of it. And that is the purpose. It is to sabotage Thailand's best interests, transform the country into a battering ram against what should be their closest and most constructive partners, to serve US interests at the expense of Thailand, just like the US did to Ukraine, where Ukraine was benefiting from relations with Russia and Europe and the United States. The US said, no, you have to pick. You're not allowed to do trade and have close relations with Russia as well. You need to pick the West. And by the way, when we say pick the West, it means we're not actually going to trade with you or build infrastructure or help your economy. We're going to militarize you and then use you as a battering ram against Russia. That's what we mean by choosing. And that's what they envision for all of Southeast Asia. And that is why people like Thanaton are hostile towards China and openly and repeatedly condemn and attempt to block cooperation with China. Thanaton would lead NED-backed protests in the streets of Thailand after losing the 2019 Thai general elections. I mentioned that. In later years, his party performed better at the polls, owed to the NED's corrosive effect across Thailand's unprotected information space. I've pointed this out many times. Thai people objectively can look at someone like Thanaton and tell that he does not represent Thailand's best interests. But because the US dominates Thailand's information space, from 2019 to now, they can repeat the lie often enough that he does somehow represent their best interests, to the point where Thai people begin to believe it. This is not democracy. This is not self-determination. This is the US manipulating the Thai population to choose to back US interests over their own best interests. And that is because ordinary people do not have the time and the energy to do deep research into all of these matters and then make informed decisions. They simply cannot. Demonstratedly, they have not. If they are picking a US-backed puppet who wants to cut ties with Thailand's largest, most important trade partner, largest investor, largest source of tourism, that obviously is not going to serve Thai people's best interests. So this is the danger of this American superweapon. Today, both in Thailand and across the rest of Southeast Asia, despite China offering an objectively better future, the US still wields unwarranted influence because of the NED, the networks of subversive political opposition groups, media platforms, and even political parties it controls, placing the region's otherwise bright future in a precarious position, much like Ukraine's prior to 2014. With the Philippines already fully captured and utilized by the US to confront and pursue conflict with China, a rising Asia still faces the possibility of being plunged into regional war like both Europe and the Middle East. And that is what the US wants to do with Asia, what it has already demonstrably done to Europe and the Middle East, which is destroy them through conflict, perpetual conflict. Now let's talk about how the multipolar world might defend against this superweapon of Washington's. Russia and China have both devised able defenses against this US superweapon of political capture. Both nations either demand transparency from so-called non-governmental organizations, which in reality are funded by the US government and serve US government interests, funded from abroad, or they've banned them altogether. Both nations have also secured their respective information space, restricting or banning US-based social media platforms, working together with the US State Department to manipulate public opinion and even manipulate national identity in targeted nations, and overseeing the flow of information with their own domestic social media platforms. In other words, if a social media platform is going to operate in any given country, it is better that the government there and the people determine how it is used than Silicon Valley and the US State Department determining that for you and your country and your population. Both nations have robust domestic media industries promoting their own respective values, as well as international media platforms that communicate their side of the story to global audiences. RT, CGTN, Sputnik, these are examples. What both nations have so far failed to do, however, is extend this expertise to partner nations. Both nations already sell a wide variety of defensive systems to partner nations to defend traditional national security domains, including airspace, land borders, and shores. Russia, China sell warships to partner nations, aircraft to defend their airspace, warships obviously defending their shores, tanks, artillery, air defense systems. All of these are exported to partner nations to help them defend their traditional national security domains. However, both nations have failed so far to communicate the critical need in the 21st century to defend a nation's information space in the first place. And neither has integrated the means of defending a nation's information space into these exports. So in other words, they could export the means to defend information space alongside all of these military means to defend their physical domains. In fact, both nations have failed so far to communicate the critical need in the 21st century to defend a nation's information space in the first place. You don't really hear the Chinese or the Russian government talking at forums about the importance of information space and defending it from US interference. Russia and China could export turnkey social media networks nations could set up and oversee themselves within their respective information spaces, displacing US-based networks and reasserting control over the flow of information within their own borders. This would allow nations and their people to decide what information can and cannot be shared instead of deferring to Silicon Valley and their partners in the US State Department. A similar package could be offered to help nations set up international media platforms like Russia's RT or Sputnik and China's CGTN, as well as domestic international pipelines for producing local journalists, educators, and future politicians and diplomats that reflect that nation's best interests, not Washington's and Wall Street's interests, as programs like the US State Department's Fulbright and Young Leadership Initiatives do. In other words, the US has entire programs that recruit young people in these targeted nations, in nations like Thailand. They see that they're interested in the media or going into politics or going into business, and they essentially recruit them and they give them these free scholarships or fellowships. They literally go to Europe and or the United States, and they're brought into these professional and personal networks before being sent back to their country. And they feel so special by being chosen by the US. They think they're special, and they will do almost anything to remain locked into those personal and professional networks. And Empire has always done this. They've always taken young people, brought them to the Capitol, and basically indoctrinated them, and then sent them back to work as administrators for the Empire rather than as a form of resistance against it. And that is all the US is doing through Fulbright and the young leadership initiatives that it maintains in Africa, Eurasia, here in Southeast Asia. In other words, what Russia and China can do is help these nations train people in their own country to become journalists, to report the news in a way that benefits these nations' best interests, rather than have them indoctrinated in the West, sent back to their country, and then just repeat what the Western media is saying, amplifying US and European propaganda rather than fighting against it and exposing it. Russia and China, as key members of BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, could lead efforts in standing up multipolar alternatives to US-based social media platforms the rest of the world can share information on, beyond the reach of US and European censorship and manipulation. Currently, Russian and Chinese social media platforms are optimized for domestic, not international use. In other words, if I'm here in Thailand, I want to share my research with people around the world, I am forced to use YouTube, X, if I wasn't censored off of Facebook, Meta, as it is called now. There is no multipolar alternative. There is no way for the multipolar world to communicate amongst themselves. They are forced to use US-based social media platforms, which ultimately throttle the flow of information in their favor. Finally, BRICS could also lead initiatives in exposing and confronting US and also European interference by encouraging regional and national NGO transparency laws and creating forums that both expose this danger and support member states taking action to confront them through legislation. In other words, instead of just a country trying to pass an NGO transparency law on their own and then facing retribution from the United States alone, this could be done in a forum made up of many multipolar nations that can support that country and its attempt to secure its political and information space from US interference. This includes providing protection against US threats, sanctions, and other coercive measures aimed at forcing targeted nations to submit to US political and information control. All of these steps are aimed at enhancing national security and upholding the self-determination of nations across the multipolar world, in line with the core principles of the UN Charter. The US National Endowment for Democracy, even in name, poses as promoting democracy worldwide, yet democracy is a means of self-determination, and everything the NED funds is determined by and for Washington, not the nations NED funding is flooding into. The NED represents Washington's greatest superweapon. Its ability to enter into and capture a nation's political, information, and academic space circumvents even the greatest conventional armies standing in the way of US hegemony worldwide. It has participated in the destabilization and destruction of nations and regions across the globe, causing damage greater than any missile Russia can design and deploy. The future of a truly multipolar world depends on defending against all of Washington and Wall Street's weapons, especially its most far-reaching and effective weapons, which I would say is the NED, organizations like it, and the political interference they conduct. At first glance, the NED and other US efforts to control political and information space around the globe don't appear to be weapons at all. Upon closer inspection, they represent the most devastating weapons of mass destruction employed this 21st century. They represent a serious threat to global peace, stability, and prosperity. Equally serious efforts must be made to expose and defend against them. And this is something that I've talked about for years and worked hard to expose for years. I would like to think that the reason the NED is erasing its disclosures from its website is because people like me and others have talked about this for years, have raised awareness, and people are beginning to wake up to the danger of US interference, and they're right at the precipice of proposing ways of dealing with it. That is what this article is hopefully going to achieve. Sketch out the type of measures nations can use to defend against US interference. And the the way the multipolar world needs to prioritize this. As I just talked about with Angelo Giuliano in a recent live stream on my channel, China offers an objectively more compelling future for the rest of the world. Its partnership, the way it interacts with partner nations, is by far preferable to the way the US and Europe interact with partner nations, proxies, politically captured proxies. Except, no matter how compelling in reality China's relationship with the rest of the world actually is, the West has the means of offering superior narratives that are more convincing, even if they're entirely fabricated and false. And so that is the danger. Human beings by nature are emotional, and they will choose an emotionally appealing narrative over an objective reality almost every single time. That is the problem. That is why it's so important to control information inside your nation, among your population, because if you don't, the US will use its ability to lie and manipulate people emotionally every single time to their advantage and to the detriment of your nation. And when I say detriment to your nation, I mean its very survival. This is what was done to Libya. It no longer exists as a sovereign functioning nation state. Neither does Syria. Neither does Ukraine. And it could be any nation, anywhere next. So I hope that governments, political groups, political parties start to talk about this more often and more seriously, and begin prioritizing this higher and higher, especially in terms of national security. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. I post all of my videos on YouTube, on Rumble, on X, and also on Telegram. I back my videos up on all 4 of these platforms. The links to all of the articles that I referenced within this article, and the link to this NEO article itself, will be in the video description below, as will be all of the other ways you can find and follow my work, as well as ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare and you're just sharing my work with others, getting the word out there, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching. And again, Happy New Year.